So I have a feeling that we have quite a few good questions out there. So I'll answer briefly. I just want to look at my watch to make sure I really do respond briefly. Let's see. I have a response to the Richard II. I am a critic of Schmidt in a certain sense. And so I think that actually your response was really kind of juicy in terms of, I think, bringing up actually quite nicely some of the points of contact between Hamlet and Richard II as figures who may be required to make certain sets of decisions that they fail to make, and who therefore may be calling into criticism a certain mode of sovereignty, and further, who may be at the cusp of a kind of medieval to modern shift that Schmidt certainly talks about in the same way Kantorowicz does. And like Kantorowicz, Schmidt talks about that as a falling off from medieval sanctification to the early modern political economy, from the decisionist sovereign to this kind of bureaucratic nightmare. And so I think that that was really helpful, the way that you brought this out. I think that my own reading of somebody like Richard II, or at least Shakespeare's engagement with somebody like Richard II, is to say that, unlike Schmidt, I think Shakespeare is very suspicious of decisionist sovereignty. I think that he shows that, in fact, the sovereign who imagines that by making one dramatic intervention in a crisis that he can solve a situation, that actually politics don't really work like that. I think, at least, and this is part of my critique of Schmidt, that it's not about the kind of charismatic decisionist leader who provides order, but it actually is about some kind of community politics that actually part of Richard's problem, or even part of Hamlet's problem, is their isolation. And if only they're able to integrate themselves into a community more, that's where kind of real political change that's substantive might happen, not just revolution in the name of another revolution in the name of another revolution. So that's a very short, fast answer. But I think that, so in other words, I guess I would say that the kind of virtu, this sort of hyper-manliness that might be sort of requested of characters like Hamlet or Richard II, again, I guess I just would say that to my reading, and of course I'm totally invested in this, but I would say that Shakespeare calls that version of sort of hyper-masculinity into question, to the extent that he actually creates a brilliant character in Hamlet who we love in the moments before he makes the hideous decision he's sort of forced to make. I don't know if that fully answers you, but the second point on your big question about how do law and literature come together? I mean, there are a variety of ways that people have answered that question. One of them is to say that the law perpetually engages with literature in the form of window dressing. So we talked about yesterday where jurists frequently cite Shakespeare in their rulings. I mean, more than any other author, Shakespeare has appeared in Supreme Court rulings in the United States, and I'm sure that's the case in many other states as well. So that's one answer. Another is that literature people are quite interested in the law thematically, so that they look at how different characters represent lawyers in his plays. We see Portia, we see Moments of Judgment. And I think that is a kind of ornamentation on both sides. Lawyers are good characters, and Shakespeare characters provide good ornamentation for legal rulings. But I think a much more substantive answer is really that what somebody like Shakespeare and something like the law, what they have in common is an investment in language and interpretation. And so I think that as much as there may be, on the one hand, a sense of law as written text, sort of as actually we were discussing, right? Law is something that comes alive in interpretation. I guess that we were talking about a case here with the Supreme Court, right? I think it was you. Cases in Brazilian law where actually there's the kind of competing interpretations of same statutes in different states. And so really the law, at least to my mind, and some of you might disagree, exists through interpretation. And that's always the case even when somebody is claiming, as often the Supreme Court does, I'm only reading the letter of the law. I want to be a pure constitutional lawyer. I want to go back to the moment of the Constitution. We have Supreme Court justices who say that, but surprisingly, of course, then their decisions, or not surprisingly, perfectly accord with their own ideological presuppositions of what they wanted the law to say. So I think that dependency of law on interpretive maneuverability is so similar to something like Shakespeare, where Shakespeare is a text, but it really comes alive in the court of the theater, in the place where people go, they attend to it, it comes alive in each of these performances. And I think that's where, in other words, literature and law have very, very different social effects, but they have very similar processes. And so I think that for each of us, it's quite important to sort of know the other terrain. Like, as a literature person, to know about the instrumentality of law and the way that language actually affects things, to me, is a challenge then to some of the readings of literature as disaffected, as somehow, artistic window dressing, which I very much disagree with. And I think similarly for lawyers to have a sense of the playfulness of language and its slipperiness and its imaginative quality, as Arthur talked about yesterday, is also really important, because in a legal brief, you can't just shift to Shakespeare as if this is a mere thin example, right? It carries much more weight than that. And so if you introduce Shakespeare into your legal rulings, you sort of need to know what Shakespeare's doing and what you're doing and how metaphor works, how all of these things that actually are sort of so present in legal rulings, they can't just be mere ornaments. So anyway, that's a little longer than I expected to go on, but as you can tell, it's something I have a lot of opinions about. So
I'd like to add to that. You said pretty much in answer to the why study Shakespeare for law, what I was going to say. I would emphasize the question of language. Lawyers want clarity. Lawyers want clarity of language. There was in the U.S. a movement you probably know about converting legal jargon and technical language into plain language, plain English. It fell on its face because there's no such thing as this kind of pure, plain discourse. All sorts of ambiguities came in. Literary scholars know that language is multivocal. It involves ambiguity. It involves multiple meanings, sometimes contradictory multiple meanings. And literary study and the study of a writer like Shakespeare, who was so sensitive to the multifaceted nature of language, reminds us of how messy human discourse and human language can be, even as we want to make it clearer for purposes of decisions, purposes of action. So a second thing, though, and I think we've talked about this more generally in dealing with Shakespeare plays, if we look at a play text which engages an audience and appeals to an audience's judgments of right and wrong, sympathetic, unsympathetic, we even address an audience in terms of issues that you might even think of as legal issues. I love this play, Measure for Measure, because it brings up a lot of legal issues, and or The Merchant of Venice with the question of literalism versus the spirit of the law. You can see how, within a world of fiction, how you can have an intellectual contest of meanings, an intellectual contest of interpretations that put that kind of process in another area that you can look at from the outside. It's not within the law, it's not within the traditions of interpretation within the law, but it can also broaden your notion of the versatility of interpretive moves that one will make. And interpretation is a very fine art in any discipline, in psychoanalysis, in law, in literary study. It is something that you can get much better at and get more sophisticated and subtle with as you see it. And I think it can be a refreshing relocation of a set of problems that you may encounter within your own discipline into another sphere that says it's fictional, and therefore, you're safe to play in your own mind with different possibilities, the way you might not be if you were in your own area of discourse, where you have a commitment, perhaps, ideologically to certain forms of interpretation, certain ideological issues, certain traditional notions or definitions that are received and accepted by you. So it can make the mind more flexible. There's lots of there are other spheres of activity like this. In the Renaissance, especially in the late 16th century, in religious discourse and moral discourse, casuistry is a very important field. And it's almost like a handbook of case law, where you've got all these situations that are supposed to be interpreted in terms of fixed moral categories that are received. And very quickly you realize in casuistical examples how everything is context specific. You can't just clamp on a rule or a moral judgment in some simple way to a very complicated set of human interactions or behavioral situations. So, Shakespeare knew he was writing for a lot of lawyers in the theater. Some of the members of his audience were members of the Inns of Court in London. The Inns of Court are the law schools that people went to for training in the common law, which is the system they use. And lawyers loved debate. They loved disquisition and argument, and they found Shakespeare's plays very satisfying from this point of view. There were plays that were invited for performance at the law schools. The Comedy of Errors, Twelfth Night. There were others. They recreated themselves at Christmas time with what they called revels, and these involved fictional activities. It involved making over the law school into the kingdom of the Prince of Love, and they would perform speeches that would be speeches about love, but they're using their lawyerly skills and their legal behavior in a kind of different environment, a different fictional context, and it's all part of intellectual training and intellectual sensitivity and nimbleness of the use of language and understanding how metaphor works. I wanted to say one more thing about the question of history. A drama that is a tragedy, they expected in Shakespeare's time to be based on real events, real historical characters. If we leave aside Othello and Romeo and Juliet, which are based on Italian novellas, the difference between a tragedy like Richard II or even about mythical English history like King Lear has a kind of, let's say, urgency and reality about it, because people believe that, in some way this happened. This is real. These are real human events.
Based on a true story.
Based on a true story. And when Rebecca outlined the tetralogy, the two tetralogies that Shakespeare wrote, she was outlining a kind of project that Shakespeare undertook to explain to his audience what happened to us as a people, as an English people, from the overthrow of Richard II to the coming of the Tudors. Now, he was following, to some extent, Tudor historians who were writing to give a kind of official line for Tudor history that saw the coming of the Tudors as God's gift to England after a tragic period of aristocratic fighting between the Lancastrians and the Yorkists. Henry of Richmond overthrowing Richard III, marrying a Yorkist princess, brings together in some way these two sides, and then we have peace and prosperity under Henry and Henry VII, Henry VIII, and etc., and Elizabeth. By the end of the 16th century, however, historians are writing a different kind of history, not just a kind of celebratory, rhetorical, propagandistic national history, but an analytic history very much based upon, for example, the kind of history that Tacitus, the Roman historian, wrote, where there's a merciless analysis of the way political figures behave. What are they really doing? What's really at stake here? What are these ideological smokescreens that are being sent out to fool people or to deceive them? What is the succession of flawed emperors all about? How can you think about sovereignty as some kind of ideal when you have a Caligula or a Nero? So there's within the discipline of history and of history writing a kind of awareness that you can somehow do political analysis and ideological analysis that is different from just celebrating the nation and its glorious history. This kind of split between propagandistic history and analytic history is all the way up through the schools to today. In the U.S., it's a demand pretty much on the high school level to write a kind of celebratory American history. You sort of glide over the embarrassing parts, and you celebrate Americanness and American values. And there are all sorts of fights on school boards and in states that want history taught in a certain way between those who want propagandistic history and those who want analytic history. It's very... Yeah, that's right. And there are certain things that can't be taught in American history in some states. And part of the problem is the state of Texas, which has the largest market for textbooks, determines pretty much the textbooks that are used in the rest of the United States for something like history. But anyway, I've strayed apart from your end.
Want to respond to that? Okay, so I have a couple of people waiting. Let's start with Floriana, please. Yep.
My question goes along the same line about the importance of Shakespeare for political theory and legal studies. But I think you added something, in my point of view, quite special today from the discussion we had yesterday. You mentioned Baudin and other scholars from which Shakespeare could have got some ideas on divine right of the king. Of course, there are others in the medieval times against that idea as well. I mentioned Marcellus of Padua, but that's not my point. I think my point is that none of them, as far as I know, actually connected the divine right of the king to tyranny. And to the contrary, actually, they connected the rebellion against the king as the point for tyranny. And Shakespeare seems to have done that, maybe for the first time, I'm not sure, to connect the divine right of the king to tyranny. And I would ask you, first of all, if there are other aspects in which he reshaped traditional political theory and legal theory. And a second question, whether that is, I think, the important thing about art. Well, let me just say, political theory in Shakespeare's plays are not as sophisticated as you find in other authors, but he shapes everything in such a way that tells you not only about what is going on at the moment in your country, but also, as Garcés showed yesterday, the possibilities of the future. And I think that a law student at one of those plays would be capable of thinking, well, maybe this is what is happening, and would be better prepared for what the future would give to you.
Well, so first of all, on this issue of Shakespeare linking divine right with tyranny. I do think he's original in doing that insofar as he's not doing it from a religious perspective. So that there are people who might have attacked the king's presumption of divine right from the Catholic perspective that says that this is actually a heretic king or queen, and so therefore divine right monarchy is part of their kind of in their tyrannical arsenal. But everybody knows that they're doing it from a very particular religious perspective. And so I think what Shakespeare adds to the conversation is instead showing not that the problem is that Richard is calling on the wrong God, or that Richard is not a good Catholic or loyal to the Pope. The problem is that divine right is a problematic political philosophy. So yes, I mean, I guess thank you for liking that part of of Shakespeare, but of my analysis of Shakespeare. And the areas where he reshaped political theory, other areas, I want to think about that a little bit more. I mean, my answer is yes, but I'm trying to think of a really good example for you. And I guess that I just more broadly would say, as I did in closing, that what I think Shakespeare brings to political theory is a study of causes and effects, and a view that takes political problems out of immediate situations and allows an audience to think about things theoretically, so that we're disarmed in a certain sense, because maybe a little bit unlike the Schmidt, we aren't always saying Hamlet is James. We're saying, what happens in this situation? What happens when you have a father come back and tell you to revenge? You know, if it were my father coming back telling me to revenge, I know what I would do politically. It would be very hard not to go off and, you know, do the thing that he ordered me to do. But in the space of the theater, so that's a sort of meta answer. But I think in the space of the theater, I suddenly am thinking, what if I were put in this position? I suddenly realize all the problems with actually obeying my father, who I love very much, who's now told me to do this thing that the, you know, first commandment tells me not to do. Or actually, is it the second? Anyway, one of the commandments. So I'll think more about the precise new political theories that he offers. But I think that on a meta level, that's my answer.
I think there's analysis of whatever political theory there is. I don't think he's an advocate.
Yeah.
I think that quote I gave yesterday from Nelson is right, that Shakespeare is not trusting any particular political theory. He's looking at political praxis and how theory has a kind of disconnect with praxis. One of the things that's embarrassing to people having a kind of liberal democratic notion, wanting to see it in Shakespeare, is one of the embarrassing things is that Shakespeare has pretty nasty portrayals of crowds and mobs and kind of popular uprising kind of things. He's not a romantic revolutionary. He has the usual conservative attitude towards revolution, not as a good thing, but as revolt, as a kind of breaking of rules that shouldn't be broken, even if it's done supposedly for a good cause. So he's not a Democrat. On the other hand, he's skeptical of absolutistic assertions of authority. But then in the middle, he sees a field where there's all sorts of constant negotiation and power struggles going on among a political elite. One of the things that I liked in Rondo's comments is the mention of medieval to modern. One of the things that's anachronistic about Richard II is that Shakespeare portrays a monarch not on the medieval model of monarchy, but on a 16th century model of monarchy. A medieval model of monarchy is more like, well, a first among equals. Everybody knows that whoever is monarch has to have the consent of the power elite, has to have enough aristocrats supporting him. There's a little bit of that in Richard II with who lines up as aristocrats on whose side. Richard has a minority. Bolingbroke gets a lot of people on his side, some of whom later rebel against him. So once you start that game of how many people can I get fighting for me and then win, then the next question is who's going to overthrow me, which is what Henry has to worry about. So this middle ground of constant negotiation and struggle is what dramatically interests Shakespeare, and he's skeptical of any system working very well. If you describe the system that Queen Elizabeth has, it's a very complicated system. She needs the support of Parliament. She needs to stage herself as a loving mother but monarch, married to her people, so she goes on progresses through England. She has to have support enough on her Privy Council. In fact, there are some occasions which it looks like opposition from her Privy Council keeps her from doing certain things she'd like to do. And she's smart enough to put on her Privy Council people who have different opinions. They can also cancel each other out. She balances political factions against one another, mainly about 3 in the late 1590s. That keeps any one of them from dominating or becoming too much of a threat. James is unwise in playing politics. Elizabeth was very smart. He came in and he lost a lot of the support of the aristocracy by bringing in a lot of Scotsmen and giving them titles and lots of goodies at court. He didn't like to stage himself, as Shakespeare says it in Measure for Measure, before his people. He didn't go on progress, didn't curry popular favor, and he fought with Parliament. Elizabeth manipulated Parliament very well. James made a big mistake in taking his chief minister, who was very skilled, Robert Cecil, and elevating him to an earldom, became Earl of Salisbury. Instead of having him in the House of Commons where the action was, he was stuck in the House of Lords. So I think Shakespeare and contemporaries of Shakespeare knew very well that this was a very complicated political system that was in place, and you had to keep on satisfying all sorts of sectors to put it all together and make it work.
Okay, everyone. Just a word here. I have the boring task of keeping track of time. We have 20 minutes now. I'd like to, or we can extend it to 10 more, but I don't want to go too much over that because everybody organizes their lives according to what we have promised in terms of time, so it's not fair that we go too much overboard. So I have 5 more people inscribed. I don't know whether anybody else wants to. Okay, so that makes 6. And okay, so Professora Juliana, please. Yeah.
Vou falar outra vez em português, peço desculpas. E vou ser bastante breve. Eu acho que, na verdade, tivemos 2 conferências maravilhosas, thank you. E tivemos também a reconstrução da própria história do conceito de soberania, né? Porque Richard II e Hamlet apontam para 2 vertentes da tradição política que, na verdade, convergem no final do século XVI para o conceito de soberania.
So 2 wonderful conferences, and in a way, Richard II and Hamlet, and in a way that allowed for the reconstruction of the concept of sovereignty, which happened at the end of the 16th century.
Richard II nos remete à tradição do direito de resistência, que é uma tradição que vem do final da Idade Média, atravessa todo o século XVI e ganha muita força, claro, no contexto das guerras de religião. E Hamlet para a razão de Estado, né, que vai ser o grande tema que Carl Schmitt vai retomar. Em ambas as peças, falta soberania, né? Não existe ainda uma concepção propriamente moderna de soberania, né? E, no entanto, Shakespeare consegue reconstruir, né, antecipar a solução que vai ser encontrada no conceito de soberania quando consegue adotar 2 posições que são antagônicas. Não sei se fui clara, né? Numa peça nos remete à questão do direito de resistência e, na outra, ao problema da razão de Estado, né? 2 tradições antagônicas que convergem na soberania.
Okay, so yes, super complex, right? So saying that Shakespeare, in a way, in these 2 plays, he sort of anticipates the modern concept of sovereignty, in the sense that he recovers the medieval resistance theories that became more important of the wars of religion in Richard II, in which you have the right to resist a tyrant. You correct me if I'm mistranslating you, please. And in Hamlet, in Hamlet he's talking about the raison d'etat, the reasons of the state, right, which is a more modern version of the debate. And the fact that he brings these two examples together and that somehow he solves them differently in both plots and anticipates the solutions and the conflictual solutions that we're going to have for the concept of sovereignty in modernity. So that these are they dovetail to form a notion of sovereignty problematic. So notion of sovereignty in modernity. So.
Wow, that's really helpful and lovely. I think that idea, it really proves one of the points we're making, that Shakespeare is trying out different political options, that here we have these two modes of sovereignty. That's really, I guess I'm wondering, because we do have so many questions, if it might be, because I'm noticing that's a question, but it's really actually a beautiful comment. And so I'm sort of wondering if we might kind of go down the list, because I'm afraid that if we're responding, we might not get to everybody.
Okay.
So I'd rather hear everybody else.
Good. Excellent.
Okay?
Right. It's wonderful. So we're going to have the whole list and of course, and then people will comment generally. Okay. Masa, please. Your time is up.
I'll try to be quick, okay?
All right.
First of all, I have to apologize for my terrible English, and I'm going to try to speak nevertheless. I would like to congratulate Professor Lemon for her wonderful speech. I've loved the paper, and I realized today that maybe I've made a mistake in my master degree. Well, but I would like to put together, again, side by side, Richard II and Elizabeth. Both were also childless, leaving the matter of succession unclear. And I would like to know that if we could relate Richard's impotence in a metaphorical way to his failure as a king, and if it's so, if we can apply the same image to Elizabeth. That's my first question. The second is, Richard II and Elizabeth both ordered the death of their relatives. And although Richard II didn't seem to feel any remorse, I think that the question of the legality of this action did not seem simple for either of them. I would like to know can we compare Richard II and Elizabeth in this sense? And was actually Shakespeare word about this issue?
All right. Yeah, well, it depends on you. You want to answer right now, or you want to build up the list?
Question.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just say quickly that I think that's fascinating, this issue of childlessness, and I think that there are many ways in which Richard, as you probably know, maybe from your thesis, is in fact depicted as being somehow kind of, I guess, impotent. Now, I would say in the case of Elizabeth, what is a little bit different is that Elizabeth is very aware as soon as she has a child or gets married or because she's a woman, that she will be ceding power. And so I think that there's something that is very smart and savvy and clever about her lack of a successor. It allows her to maintain political power in a way that I think isn't totally true for Richard. So that's my very short answer. Thank you.
Let me add something. In Henry IV, Part 1, the audience knows that Mortimer has been named by Richard II as his successor to the throne. So there's a named Yorkist successor in that play, and the fact that Bolingbroke, or Henry IV, doesn't want to ransom him from captivity looks like he's doing it because he doesn't want a possible successor rival circulating freely. So the succession issue kind of gets diverted a bit, but redefined in terms of a possible conflict that's going to come out down the line.
Right, Mais.
Well, first of all, thanks for being here, Professor Marotti. Thanks for being here, Professor Lehmann, Professor Garcês, and Professor Macedo. I would just like to make an observation on how the theater is definitely related to law. And if you could comment on it, I would appreciate it. Although practicing law is usually related to more concrete and to more pragmatic subjects, as in literature, we as law operators have to basically play a fictional game, a juridical play every day. And in this sense, there are law schools nowadays even offering drama classes, something I personally believe in, I consider really reasonable. Since that, to deal with the law, day-by-day challenges properly, one has to be able to deal basically with fictional material. We have to be able to deal, to work, to speak, and to write basically on a fictional role. That basically what law operators do. That's it.
Okay.
My quick comment is a word that I hadn't introduced earlier is the word narrative. So I don't know in Portuguese what, but so narrative or so fiction, storytelling, the process of how we tell a story. You're absolutely right. It's totally fundamental to legal proceedings. You know, how do you tell a story in a trial? What is the narrative of events? So much is piecing together beginning, middle, ending, and making a judgment on that. And so this is a really, it's just a really astute point. I mean, I think absolutely. So my basic answer is yes, yes.
Okay. So, Professor Galindo?
Yeah, that was a wonderful speech as well. I would like just to point out something that Professor Ronaldo said, and a response from Professor Rebecca, which was about the decisionism in Schmidt and a possible decisionism in Shakespeare. And I was wondering if this topic has any connection to what Professor Arthur yesterday said about the role of theater for Shakespeare, which was to promote, to foster contestation. And I was thinking about maybe, I don't know, I would like to hear from you about that, but maybe one of the functions of theater for law or for legal thinking is not helping lawyers to make decisions, but maybe helping lawyers to debate, helping lawyers to contest theses. I don't know. It's just something I was wondering about, and maybe there is a connection. I would like to hear from you.
Maybe just helping lawyers to see that stories are constructed.
Yeah.
You know?
But not to decide.
Yeah. So.
Okay, so have Lucas. Please. I'll give everybody on the panel an opportunity to talk at the end, okay? No, go ahead. Yeah.
Just a quick remark about Professor Marotti's answer and about literature and law, and a quick question. I would like a quick remark of you, because we see in law today, as we wander away from formalism, that law is not enough. And we have the Supreme Court in 1995 quoted Mending Wall from Robert Frost. And there are people that consider judicial opinion as a literary journal. My question is, what is the role of literature in law today, and what it can be in years to come? The actual role.
Short answer is I don't know. Let's leave that for the general comments at the end. Okay.
Rafael Abdush, please.
I believe that law is a process of interpretation or creation, as literature is a process of interpretation or creation. But I think this is not related to the system, to the legal system. I mean, This is this way both in common law and in civil law. Despite that, it's much harder to find books on law and literature in civil law countries' languages. For instance, I am interested in the subject, and I went to the library here some days ago, and the books I could find on law and literature in Portuguese or in French or in Italian were translations of English books or American books. I'd like to know, what do you think, why is that? Is there a reason, in your opinion, and my commentary goes towards the legal education my professor Ronaldo was talking about, and why the development of the subject in these civil law countries is taking so long when compared to common law countries?
Okay, so I think what I'll do is okay. Yeah. So I'll start with Ronaldo. I'll say something myself. I can't resist, and then I'll pass on to the two of you. So I think we should be profound and thorough in around 40 seconds. Okay.
Thanks. Well, there's so many quite interesting questions. First of all, I'd like to make a comment on what Juliana said. I think that one of the most interesting things in literature, and especially in theater, and even more especially in Shakespeare, as far as political ideas are concerned, is that being an author of plays, he can give many voices to many different perspectives. And I think that his main target is not basically to make a political statement or taking a political position, even though we can clearly find some engagement, political engagements, and some kind of prudence, some kind of caution in how to deal with political issues. However, I think one of the most interesting things about his genius is to show the political dilemmas. That means he's able to put in his characters the problems, as much as as Plato did with Socrates, in the sense that, but Socrates was making statements at the end of the dialogue. But I think that Shakespeare is probably more raising the questions than offering the answers. And I think that as far as, for example, this political dilemma of obedience and resistance, or decision or indecision, or the new model of modern state and the pre-modern state, I think that, and this I absolutely agree with the Schmidtian interpretation. I think that one of the reasons why, for example, Hamlet is very contemporary is because the dilemmas that were starting to grow at that time were closely connected with the new dilemmas posed by the Enlightenment. And Enlightenment is not finished yet. I mean, we are still living some of the same dilemmas. Should we obey the law? Or, for example, now all the theories and the debates on should we enforce a kind of international natural law in humanitarian interventions or not, and also the very idea of how can this state take the most difficult decisions, the flaws of the electoral systems. All these issues have to do with new problems posed by Enlightenment, and I think that I think that we don't have to take a side with a decisionistic interpretation or a decisionistic position
as a kind of solution for these dilemmas, to understand that the issue of the decision was there. We don't have to, and I don't think that even in Schmidt's interpretation of Hamlet, he's not being apologetic of his own political ideas. I think that he was just putting some light on how the issue of the political decision is a very central tenet. And of course, in other works, he was, of course, backing some more decisionistic positions, but not in this interpretation. And, well, as far as and besides, I think that the contemporary presentation of the problem of indecision and the decisionism as one of its branch is more clearly stated during Romanticism and not in Shakespeare's plays. So Romanticism poses very clearly the idea that a political decision could be taken from the nothing, from the void, from just a matter of the expression of a sovereign will, which is a central tenet in the modern conception of sovereignty. And this is not the case in Shakespeare. So, again, what I think is important there is that the issue of the difficulty of taking decisions, the eternal doubt, the eternal doubting, which is a very this is what is still contemporary as a political issue. Let me say something about the law and literature, even though this is very, very broad issue. Just I'd like to add that for me, both law and literature are not only areas in which we make interpretations, they are interpretive subjects themselves, in the sense that our very conception, our very definition, our very concept of law and the very concept of what's literature requires us to have some kind of position about what is a artistic creation. And whenever we have like a play like Richard II or Hamlet to analyze, one of the most important and interesting things to do is how should we interpret the many voices, the voices of the characters, their speech, what are the intentions of the characters. But even more than that, what is the intentionality of the work of art itself? What is the intentionality of Richard II or Hamlet? And by this I mean we don't have to take the idea of intentionality as something strictly connected with intentions of the author or the intentions, the psychological intentions of the characters, but basically how is the main point, the main sense that we can take whenever we are in position to analyze and to interpret a play such as this one that we were talking about. And I think that we have the same kind of perspective when we are interpreting law. First of all, when we are interpreting law, for example, if Brazilian law allows gay marriage or not, something like that, first of all, we have to start with a very conception on what is law. As much as when we start discussing what is the artistic value of Hamlet or whatever, we have to start with what is our conception of art, or what are we supposed to find whenever we start reading a play like this. So I think we have to take a interpretive stake from the very beginning. And this is one of the most interesting similarities I find, and this is one of the reasons why I think it's also useful as a training method, but much more than that. We have a more deep connection, which is this interpretive attitude that we have to have, both concerning literature and law.
All right, just want to quick comment on this law and literature, and I think following up what Ronaldo said, I think of course they both involve interpretation. It is very important. However, in order to decide whether an interpretation is good or not, we have to have a worldview, right? I can say your interpretation is wrong, your interpretation is right. It doesn't make sense to me. And this is based on core beliefs, and this has to do with what has been talked about myth and allegory. It's amazing how important the ideas we make of the world shape our actions on the world. If I were to ask everybody here, are you happy? Are you happy with your life? Are you happy with your family, with your university, with your job, with your prospects, with your country, with the politics? Now, the thing is that, now you don't have to answer me. You don't have to answer me. But the thing is that the way to answer this, the only way you can answer this is by comparing what you go through or what you imagine to go through to some sort of standard. And this standard is our imaginary. This standard is not something physical, but it's more powerful than physical things. And that's why it's so hard when you're miserable, because it's very hard to change that, unless you can tell yourself a different story. If you feel that we are miserable politically, we have to tell a different story. But in order to perceive our misery, we need to have other narratives, as you say, right? So I think that the deep connection between law and literature, that of course involves interpretation, is that the building blocks that allow us to make sense of our life and what we want to be, right, are very clear in literature. And from what we want to be, or what I think we feel we are entitled to be, because we feel that we are entitled to be happy. Now, in order to be entitled to be happy, and that's a certain kind of happiness, today it seems to be consumerism, right? But because we feel that we are entitled to be happy, and we have a certain notion of happiness, what happiness is, we believe that we have certain rights. Certain things should be rights, not only possibilities. And in order to enforce such rights, we need a certain kind of state. So that's why I think it is a crucial conception, a crucial connection between subject as a self and subject as a citizen. And I think so the mythical part, the beliefs we are based on, is the crucial connection. From there, literature will do some things, law will do some other things. But we're talking here about what we believe we are, and we feel we are entitled to be what we are, whatever that is. And we need a system that allows us to become what we want to be, and this is law. But defining what we are has to do with the stories we tell about ourselves. We tell stories about our families, we tell stories about our childhood. These stories shape us, and we tell stories about our country, about our politics, about what we're going to be. So I think this is a very important thing that has been mentioned about in here: narrative, myth, and allegory. These are perhaps the most, Arthur mentioned that yesterday, these are perhaps what define us as humans. And we should never forget that, although it's hard to believe, law is a human thing, right? So.
That just seems like such a good place to end. I mean, right? Kind of, isn't it? Like, I think my answer is going to be sort of, I can just answer you about civil law later, right? Don't you think? Really? I mean, that was just so perfect. It's like, come on, everything's just going to be a bit of a, I mean, not.
Blah, 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 blah.
Really, nobody wants to go after that. It was like magical.
Okay. All right, you're very. I mean, that's super kindness, and I want really to thank very much Professor Arthur Marotti and Professor Rebecca Lehman for their kindness, their intelligence, and today also I want to thank very much Ronaldo Porto Macedo. It's always a pleasure to listen to him. He's quick, smart guy with always great insights, and above all, I as I said, I want to thank everyone present here. Academic thinking, as everything else in life, is supposed to be done together, right? We have our weaknesses, we have our strong points, and I think that by discussing together, we can perhaps get somewhere, but if not, have a lot of fun in the process. So I want to thank you all, and I want to, this will shift to Portuguese, just a quick announcement. Essa tarde nós vamos ter uma conversa com os professores brasileiros, com os colegas brasileiros, sobre quais as próximas etapas desse esforço. Acho que a gente pode programar mais coisas nesse sentido, envolvendo mais instituições. Gostaria que a gente tivesse alunos envolvidos, pessoas da academia, de fora da academia, para trabalhar com esse novo campo que vai nascendo aqui, né? Vai ser às 15h, todos os colegas, claro, a gente está esperando, mas também, se os alunos quiserem vir para dar sugestões, para dar opiniões, é sempre muito rico. And so once more, I really want to thank you all and ask for a nice round of applause for Marotti, Rebecca, and Hannah.